there's an HTML block that gets CSS inside, and that's how the two hold hands. Anyways, yeah, okay. So this is like a nursery rhyme for developers that I just made up on the fly. So excuse my singing and bad lyrics.
Nothing personal, but keep your day job.
Keep my day job.
This episode is brought to you by our friends at Raygun. Raygun gives software teams instant visibility into the quality and the performance of their software. And I'm here with John Daniel Trask, co-founder and CEO of Raygun. So, JD, let's talk about the challenge that software teams have. Are there really teams out there that don't have error tracking or error monitoring? Because you've been doing this for quite a while now. Have you ever met a team that's like, what is that? Why would I do that? Or is it super clear we must have error tracking?
It's becoming more common, but most folks that we're bringing on board are still coming from nothing. I think that the next phase is in that telemetry and observability side of things. Like the cutting edge people are absolutely doing it already, and they've been doing it a wee while, but a lot of people are coming on to that. And I often think about it as like, you've made this investment in CI/CD, but until you close that loop with real-time insights coming from your production code, you're actually not making the most value of your CI/CD pipeline. You've got repeatable, dependable builds going out, but you're not actually being able to fail forward and respond to customer feedback that's automatically provided as quickly as you could.
Okay, so if you are of the majority of new customers to Raygun, coming to them with no error monitoring, no error tracking in place, you can try it out for free today. A free 14-day trial is waiting for you at raygun.com. No credit card required. Join thousands of software teams out there who use Raygun every single day. Learn more at raygun.com. Again, raygun.com.
This is JS Party, your award-winning weekly celebration of JavaScript and the web. Strap in and prepare to get schooled on all things HTML and CSS. Seriously, this is a long one, maybe even our longest episode of all time, and it's filled with knowledge. We hope you enjoy it. Special thanks to our friends at Fastly for shipping our pods super fast to wherever you listen. Check them out at fastly.com and to fly.io. Deploy your app servers and database close to your users. No ops required. Learn more at fly.io. Okay, hey, it is party time, y'all.
Hey, all right, JS Party listeners, I'm sitting here literally dancing. We've got dancers, we've got dance bombers. I don't even know. Somebody's like dancing behind Estelle. So it's me, Amal. I'm here with you today, and we have such an awesome show ahead. Very special guest with me today, Estelle Weyl, literally the person who helped co-author the definitive CSS guide. Super duper SME on the web platform, especially when it like the CSS and HTML parts of the web platform. I feel like your job, Estelle, is like literally like teacher of the internet or something like that. That's your job description, because you've literally just been teaching and educating developers for just like, you know, how long now? Decades. I want to say decades, but I like...
I started my first blog 15 years ago, so in 2007.
Wow.
That's when I taught people how to use the Firebug debugger, which was the first developer tool.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So it's been a while, and I view myself as an interpreter of specifications.
Ooh.
Yeah, because the specs are written for browser authors, and very few people go and read the specs. So I wanted the subtitle of CSS, the Definitive Guide. The 5th edition is coming out probably in March. We're finishing it up right now. Eric Meyer's writing most of it, but I'm helping him. And I wanted to subtitle it, We Read the Specs So You Don't Have to.
Nice.
O'Reilly put the kibosh on that, but they did say they would put it on the back cover.
Oh, very cool. Oh, I love that. Why did they put a kibosh? That's such a great tagline. Like, we read the specs so you don't have to. Like, isn't that, like, I would buy that book. Like, take my money. Like, come on, O'Reilly, you know?
I hear for search optimization reasons, writing the presentation of layer of the web is going to get more hits. But
got it. Okay, all right, SEO gods, you win.
Yeah.
But that said, we already kind of did an implicit warm intro for you. Can you please just tell our listeners,
okay,
who are you, what do you do, and tell us a little bit about your background, Estelle.
So My name is Estelle Weyl, and you got my last name correct. Thank you very much. Few people do. I have 3 jobs right now, kind of. As I said, I am co-authoring the 5th edition of CSS The Definitive Guide. I am also writing Learn HTML for web.dev. So the first 5 sections are out. The next 5 sections should be coming out in about 3 weeks. It'll be a total of a 20-section course. And even though it's Learn HTML, it's really targeted towards beginners all the way to super advanced people who don't realize that they don't know things. And then my full-time job is working for Open Web Docs. So Open Web Docs is a nonprofit open source. We maintain open source projects. And the open source project we're focused on is maintaining Mozilla Developer Network, or MDN. So MDN is part of Mozilla, but we actually do our team of 4.5 people. It's not that we have a half person. We have one person who works half time for Mozilla and half time for us.
Yeah.
But we have 4 full-time and 1 part-time. And we do 63% of the code reviews. And we do 11% of the PRs. So 89, I can do math. 89% come from other people, but those are people who find typos, which we love the fact that they're doing that. But we're the ones who do like the major changes. Like if the side nav bar has changed and the layout has changed and, you know, there's now page types. And one of the recent projects was changing every occurrence of var as a keyword in JavaScript to const or let. So that was 26,000 occurrences. So that was a MDN and Open Web Docs partnership to get the community to do the, I don't know, it's like 860 PRs to get those. So we are at 20,000 plus. Oh, I'm looking right now at a PR. That PR number is a week old and it's 21,875. So I'd say we're probably at 23,000 right now.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's how frequently the docs of literally the docs that help, this is like the stuff that everybody has open on a tab, or if you're like me, several tabs. So first of all, what an incredible and humbling background. Like really, Estelle, I mean, I'm such a fangirl. Like you have no idea. I mean, you're someone who I've admired for many years, for a very long time. I've had the opportunity to meet you a few times in person as well. You know, you just kind of, you dig into stuff, you nerd out, and not only do you nerd out, but you help elevate all of us while you nerd out about stuff. So there's like, everybody wins here. But I'm curious to kind of, before we kind of get into like the meat of the show, so we invited you here to kind of talk about some of the new stuff that's happening with CSS and HTML. We're here to learn a little bit about how things get into the web, right? So we often in the JavaScript community think, a lot about TC39 and that whole process. So CSS and HTML are also managed through working groups similar to ECMA, which is the specification of JavaScript. And so can you tell us a little bit about how we get things into CSS land? What's the process for them showing up in the browser? Right. And then there's like WHATWG, which is another body for HTML, which I always mispronounce.
So I call it WHATWG. I don't know what their name actually, who knows exactly how to pronounce an acronym anyway.
Yeah.
So the way WHATWG, I guess that's what I'm calling it today, was created is the specification group, this W3C, was focused on making XHTML. So I don't know if you remember XHTML, but XHTML was basically coding HTML with XML syntax, which meant requiring lowercase elements and attribute names. And it required closing all elements, and it was very strict. Whereas there was a division, and people wanted to make it more loosey-goosey, because before, browsers, basically, if you put up anything, the browsers will render it. There's a few tags, like if you open up a style tag, or if you open up a script tag and you don't close it, or text area tag, the browser's going to think everything that's coming up afterwards is part of that text area style. But everything else is pretty much like you don't close it, it renders it, it's fine. You don't put a head in your document.
Very forgiving.
Yeah, very forgiving. So these two camps divided, and then everyone basically said, no one wants to write XHTML anyway because it's really ridiculously hard. So everyone went with the WHATWG, but it still included all of the features of XHTML, basically just being less, I guess, pedantic or less strict.
Mm-hmm.
So like there's a doc type. The doc type, it's not called doc type anymore. I can't remember what the word is. 'Cause someone corrected me when I said doc type. They're like, no, it's a document.
It's not doc type anymore? This is like news to me. Oh, it's a document type?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
I can actually look it up.
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
So do you remember how you were saying how you have MDN open in several browsers?
Yes.
I actually have the Edge browser.
I have it open in several tabs.
Yes. So I actually have it as a search engine.
Are you serious? Can
Yeah,
you teach people how to do that? Maybe that's its own show. Or we'll put a link. I don't know if you have a blog post.
So basically it says, you know, you can choose what you want as your search engine, whether you want it to be DuckDuckGo or something else. I'm not going to say Google. Yeah, I'll say Google. So originally it's Edge. It was Bing. Who wants Bing as a search engine? Mm-hmm. So I set my default search to MDN, and whenever I type something in the URL, it searches for MDN, but my homepage is still Bing. So if I type something in the URL, like the big search thing in the middle of the Bing page, the homepage, then I can actually search Bing, which isn't always that helpful. MDN is actually much more helpful. So let's type in doctype and see what they call it.
Wow. Okay, so first of all, like, mind blown right now. I'm like, this is like the ultimate pro tip for developers. It's like, just change your default search engine to be MDN, because really that's where most of your work-related searches are going anyway. It's your work computer, you know? So, yeah, that's awesome.
So I do it in my Edge browser. My main browser is Firefox. You said yours was Brave.
Brave, yes. I said that offline if anybody was curious as to how Estelle knew that.
I personally don't like the CEO of Brave, so I like their browser, but I will never use it.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
But I use Firefox because they're much more secure. And then the app that we're using to record this, it says it uses Chrome only. And I'm like, oh no, Chrome. And then I tried getting my audio and video to work. And I have so many security features put into my Chrome browser because, one, I don't use the Chrome browser at all, but I definitely block everything.
Yeah.
That I couldn't actually get this app to work in Chrome.
Right. Oh, that's so smart, though. That's like a good hack. If you have to use Chrome, like, go aggressive on the security flags. For what it's worth, Firefox is my default at work, and on mobile, I use Brave and I use Firefox Focus, which is like an awesome for mobile, like a shopping site or whatever. You just close it. You don't have to worry about, things even moving between sessions. But anyways, we digress. So bringing it back to CSS.
Okay.
Not just CSS. So what WIG is the standards body for HTML? What is that for CSS?
So CSS is the CSS working group.
And is it like open? Can like anybody join? ?
I am not a member of the CSS working group. A lot of people think I am.
Oh, wow.
But I am actually not.
This is a shock.
Yeah. So I know a lot of people in the CSS working group, but there's different sections to the CSS working group. So originally CSS1, I guess it was created in 1996. It was Heiko Moili and Bert Boss were like the two people who created it originally, and they created some features, and then it became a working group, and then there was CSS1, and then there was CSS2, and then there was CSS 2.1, and then there was quote-unquote CSS3, but CSS3 is not actually a thing. There is no CSS3 specification.
I thought this whole time that CSS3 existed because CSS4 was like this really big deal a few years ago. Remember? Everyone was talking about CSS4, like, so there's no 3? Like,
there is no 3.
Okay.
And there's no 4.
There's no 4?
No, there's no 5. There's not going to be a 6 either. It's a living standard. So what WG, the HTML, it's not HTML5 anymore. It's HTML, the living standard. And CSS is also a living standard. I don't think they call it that. But if you look at certain things like CSS Flexbox has CSS Flexible Modules 1, and then it has 2. And Grids has 1, and then 2. I believe Subgrid is in 2. Colors, I think we are at 4 is a candidate recommendation, which means it's been approved. But they're working on, I can actually look. So if you look up, get your browser to have MDN as your default
search engine.
Yep. So I'm going to look up just color. Oh, it's going to give me color. I don't want color. I want color as a value. Okay. So color data type, the specifications, I can just click on specifications. It goes down to specifications. It's CSS color module level 4, but I believe they're working on 5, which has new colors. Let me see. Nope. Lab, LCH, OK Lab, and HWB are actually their new color functions, and they are in CSS colors level 4. Let me just double check that is.
Okay, this is like a real-time search. I love it.
Yeah. So the CSS color module level number 4. So it's not CSS 4, it's colors level 4. It was last published 2 days ago. Okay. It includes some new color types. So it keeps going, and then they approve that version, and then they start working on it. So they're probably already working on a 5th version of some things. I'm not sure if colors is one of them. I don't think so.
Okay.
But don't quote me on that because I'm not actually in the CSS working group. I never thought about working for the specifications because I attended a spec session one time, and it was a fascinating discussion. We spent 1 hour talking about HTML imports, and the topic was if you have an HTML import with a JavaScript function, let's say named foo, and that imports a file that has a JavaScript function named foo, that imports another file that has a JavaScript function named foo, which imports the first file, which foo function wins?
This sounds like
mind blown.
Yeah, Google senior staff engineer that only works on CSS interview riddle. Like, OMG. Oh.
Yeah. There were 12 brilliant people in the room talking about this for an hour, and I'm just like, whoa. I mean, it sounds so simple and so basic, and it's like, you have to think that there's billions of web pages, and this could happen to any web page in any language, on any device. How do you handle this?
Yeah, that is some really insanely cool stuff, because, I mean, for me, the CSS and HTML spec, especially CSS, I feel like is so deeply complex because it's literally it's what tells the story of visual rendering on the web. And then you have to respect, like, CSS has to play nicely with HTML, and HTML is content based, and content is like, it's as complex as the human language scheme, right? Like you said, Mongolian, Japanese text, Mandarin text, Arabic text, English text, French, Spanish, accents, no accents, right?
Right.
So how does CSS play nicely with something that's so there's a big permutations list, which is really fascinating to even think about. But yeah, I get that. So we're going to dig into some of the new CSS features in the next segment. We're going to try not to nerd out too much because this is the Pandora's box topic, right? Because it is literally going into rendering engines and browser engines, and it can get complex. So I'm going to try my best to reel it in, but no guarantees. So
I just want to add one more thing before we cut off, because this is actually really interesting. Remember how we were talking about what WG is and how that is, the HTML living spec now?
Yeah.
Ian Hickson is the one who started the WG, and he's actually the former editor of the list specification, the CSS list specification, because they are so tied together. HTML had to figure out, you put the language attribute is put into your HTML, but the language attribute has to impact the CSS of what bullet type you're going to use.
Oh, yeah. Those are very intertwined.
So they're very intertwined because you can't actually put a Mongolian bullet point with HTML. That has to be done. That can be done with styles. But what I will do during our 5-minute break in between is do a test and see if I use Mongolian as a language, will the bullets come up as Mongolian or not? I don't know.
We'll find out. Stay tuned.
That's a type of nerdery that I get into.
Yeah, I mean, it's just going into the deep kind of bowels of the web. It's the 80-20 rule. It's not even 80-20 in this case, because it's, the web has to work for everyone. And so we have to consider every type of use case, because the internet is a utility. It is an important utility. It's part of how people communicate and do business. And so not having support for Mongolian is not an option, because there's an entire nation of Mongolia, and they matter, they count, right? So it's fascinating. So anyways, we'll be right back, everyone. See you after these short messages.
What's up, friends? This episode is brought to you by SourceGraph. With the release of SourceGraph 4.0 and the Starship event just a few weeks behind us, it is super clear that SourceGraph is becoming not just code search, but a full-on code intelligence platform. And I'm here with Joel Kortler, product manager of Code Insights for SourceGraph. Joel, this move from code search to code intelligence is a really big deal. How would you explain this feature, Code Insights, if you're just talking to folks in the hallway track of your favorite conference?
I would really start with the technical, because before I was product manager, I used to be an engineer as well. And it's really cool and exciting just to be able to say, we're going to turn your code base into a database. And the structured language that you need to interact is just the ability to write a code search. Literal search, that's totally fine. Regular expression, that'll give you a few more advanced options, even a structural search. But the number of long tail possibilities it unlocks, truly the journey of building this product was just saying, well, we've just unlocked, an infinite number of possibilities. We got to figure out some immediate use cases so we can start to, invest in this product, build it and sell it. But we're only getting started in terms of the number of uses that we're uncovering for it. The story I told you about discovering version tracking turned out to be a really important use case that wasn't even on our roadmap 6 months prior to discovering that, as we were already planning to launch this product, until we talked to enough folks, realized this was a problem, and then found, that's a simple regular expression capture group that you can just plug right in, because we really built this system to not limit the power of what we built. We don't want to give you 3 out of the box templates and you can only change one character or something. It's truly the templates are there to hold your hand and get you started, but if you can come up with anything you want to track in your code base, you can do that with Code Insights.
I love it. Thank you, Joel. So right now there is a treasure trove of insights just waiting for you, living inside your code base. Your code base is now a queryable database thanks to SourceGraph. This opens up a world of possibilities for your code and the intelligence you can gain from it. A good next step is to go to about.sourcegraph.com/code-insights. The link will be in the show notes. See how the teams are using this awesome feature. Again, about.sourcegraph.com/code-insights. Again, this link is in the show notes.
Okay, Estelle, so you left us on a cliffhanger. Where did we end up on that does this work on the web question?
So during the break, I tested a code pen and I put in an ordered list. I made the language Hebrew and I put one word in Hebrew. And then I checked to see what the list items, the bullets look like. So one of the versions is the default decimal, and one of the versions I have the type attribute saying A, so it should be letters, and nothing happened. So then I put an ordered list in, or CSS rather. I styled the ordered list to say list style type Hebrew. If you're looking at the code pen, you'll want to remove the dash that makes the CSS fail. Remove that dash and wait a second, and it will update, and you will see the number 7, 29, and 30 in Hebrew as the bullets. So to add to that, if you want some HTML trivia, the value attribute goes on the LI, and you can change where it starts counting. I always thought that it went on the OL, but it actually goes on the LI. And so all subsequent numbers it'll continue on from there. And the type attribute goes on the OL itself. There's 5 choices, but use list style type because it'll override it. However, important to note, because this is really pedantic, if you're writing a legal document, such as, if you're a lawyer, you want it to be numbered correctly, even if the CSS doesn't come through. And that's when you do want to use the type attribute. So include the type attribute if it's a legal document, or if you want it to show up even if the CSS doesn't show up. But it really has no impact if you're using CSS, which you should be using. Sorry for going down that rabbit hole, but that's why I write stuff.
So wow, Estelle, we're in the rabbit hole for sure, but we'll put a link in the show notes to the code pen so you all can see what we're talking about. But it's fascinating. It's about ordered lists and unordered lists and how they manage their children and how languages are affected by that and blah, blah, blah. But it's really just kind of an insight. It's a small sliver into kind of the complexity of the web platform and the complexity that needs to be handled. And so I think maybe some empathy for all of you when it comes to kind of thinking about standards bodies and why do things take so long? Well, it's because we really have to consider every use case for the web. And that's like, it's not negotiable, right? Like,
Right.
It doesn't matter. Like the internet has to work for everybody. And it can't break,
Yep.
right? It's a functional utility. So
If you go back to that import discussion, import was in the standard track many years ago. And I actually gave a talk on how to write custom elements or web components using HTML import, and gave the talk at a conference, and then they dropped the spec because they could not, I don't know if it's that example that I gave of not knowing which file would use foo, but it was some type of issue like that where it couldn't be resolved. So they came up with a completely different spec. And you'll see, like if everyone remembers app cache, that went by the wayside. So it was a spec that came out. It wasn't tested out enough. It wasn't tried by enough engineers. Everyone probably knows Jake Archibald's article, App Cache is a Douche, which basically killed App Cache. I can now see you Googling.
Oh, yeah, I am. I'm just like, it's fine. I'm not going to Google, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is fascinating. So HTML imports I had such hope for them. I was like, can this be a thing? Can we make this happen? Right? Because if we got that to work, I mean, it would have really been a game changer for like simple web development. But I'm just, I was just so sad to see that spec die, right?
But we got something in return. We got slot and templates.
Okay.
We can do it. It's just different. But the interesting thing, and this might bring us to the next topic, is add imports in CSS. We were always told to never use add imports.
Okay.
And now we should use add imports.
Yeah.
Because browsers now support cascade layers. And the easiest way to import a third-party script and put it into a cascade layer is to use add import, because you can't actually use the link tag to put something directly into a cascade layer.
Okay.
So I think that brings us to the next topic, and you probably want to intro the next topic.
Yeah, no, I'm burning to talk about this. It's okay. That's okay. That's all right. I've just given up on like us not going into rabbit holes, because this whole topic is just like a minefield of rabbit holes, right? It's like, how deep does it go? Guess what? Very deep. Okay.
Very deep.
But anyway, so new CSS features. So there's so much that's been going on. And I kind of wanted to kind of just intro this discussion with kind of an overview of this initiative that's been going on that's now been rebranded as like Interop 2022. But there was Interop. I don't know I feel like there was so many interop efforts going on. I was even involved in some of these many years ago when I was working at Boku, working on very important interop issues and fixing and helping browser engines kind of work more uniformly across the board, and there's projects like Test 262, which is maintained by the TC39, which, I've contributed to, which help essentially test JavaScript's implementation of JavaScript, in JavaScript. It's so meta. And so, you're writing tests in JavaScript that are run by engineers writing C++ engine code. The JavaScript tests are written to test new JavaScript features. And so interoperability is super important, and there's many ways that like we can achieve interoperability. And one of those on the web platform is a project called WPT, Web Platform Tests, another project that I've also been involved in the past. And so Web Platform Tests is an incredible project that helps browsers run tests. And is this blue? Is this red? I don't know. Is your blue the same as my blue? I don't know, right? Like, how do we surface that? We can use robots and machines and screenshots and all kinds of fancy tooling to kind of ensure that like a blue in Chrome is the same blue in Firefox, right? And it's not just blue, right? Blue is a small example. It goes deeper than that. Like the list views, CSS list, do those work correctly, right? It's pretty much every single web API is testable. And those tests are actually written in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And so if you're actually interested in contributing to those projects, they're open source, open for contributors. You're welcome to go make the web platform better, help find bugs between browsers. And you can also look at like interoperability ratings.
I'm looking at the Interop right now. And when we started the Interop 2022 in January, Safari was the lowest at 58%, and Firefox was the highest at just around 70.1, and Safari was at 59. And now the range is 85.8 to 90.7.
Wow.
So we still have 2 months left of the year, but they're really moving forward. Cascade Layers is at 100% interoperability. Viewport Units, web compatibility, I don't know exactly what that stands for. Viewport Units is 100% across the board. Firefox is still at 96% for Cascade Layers, so I'm not sure which single test is failing, but I could click on it right now if there wasn't a cat on my arm.
And so what Estelle's talking about are basically, there's the overall interop, right? So like, how do things work across browsers as a overall percentage? Like what's the score for Chrome versus Firefox in terms of the number of, like, how far they're straying from the spec, right? And so and then you can actually look in specific features. It's like, okay, for Cascade Layers, like, is there 100% interop? Like, does it work 100% the same across the board for all browsers? And that answer can be yes or no, right? And a project that I actually worked on the JavaScript side is called Test 262 Report, and we'll put a link in the show notes. That actually shows you the interop for JavaScript features across the board for different browsers. Super cool. Can you tell us, Estelle, like how interop like has been driving new CSS features as well as kind of improving CSS support across the board, but between all these browsers? And yeah.
Well, what's really exciting about all the browsers working together with, I believe, still Buku as well and Igalia, is that they've promised to get these things done. So it used to be like browsers used to be, I'm focusing on this and I'm focusing on that. But now they're all agreeing to focus on specific things. So we know we can use them by the end of the year. So like I've been waiting for the dialogue element forever. The reason the dialogue element has been taking so long is accessibility concerns. Like, where do you put the focus when you close the dialogue element? Where do you put the focus when you open the dialogue element? These are accessibility issues that really all the browsers had to agree on it because it needs to be the same in the end. So now I'm looking at the interop right now. It's the lowest is 94 to 99% interoperability for the dialogue element with the support of the inert attribute on content behind it. That should be automatic. And so I'm like, oh, it's at 99%. I can start writing about it and talking to people about it and getting people to implement. And I've spent the last 8 years, 12 years telling people don't use dialogues because of the accessibility issues. I know that the spec focuses on accessibility and makes sure that things are fairly accessible. There is stuff that's not accessible, like Canvas. Good luck making that accessible. I mean, you can if it's just a static picture and you can provide an ARIA label description, but you can't actually make something that's changing accessible without updating ARIA live regions. And is it worth updating ARIA live regions depending on what you're creating? I can be pretty confident that the dialogue element is somewhat accessible, and I no longer have to put up red flag warnings every time I use this element or create a React component that does the exact same thing as a dialogue element. And we don't need to create a React component that creates a dialogue element because we have it now in HTML.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that. Like, I mean, really strengthening our primitives enables us to just also ship less code and focus more on the kind of business logic and the things that we can uniquely do as engineers for our customers, right? Kind of wasting cycles on solving solved problems is not a productive use of time. And quite frankly, it's not the best use of time for our users either, right? So I think like that's hugely exciting. So getting into kind of some of the things that you find really exciting that's new to CSS, do you kind of want to walk us through, for example, the has selector feature that's pretty new?
Okay. So the has selector, we've been talking about a parent selector since forever.
Okay.
And so now the has, let me see if it's on the interop. I know it's in the interop. I just don't know where it is in the interop. So I'm not seeing it, but but I could just go to MDN, look at browser compatibility and see that it is everywhere. It still says a flag in Firefox, but I know that I tested it in Firefox and it worked perfectly fine. So it must be some edge case where it's, because I know I didn't enable this feature. So maybe the BCD needs to be updated, or maybe I am not fully with it. But the has is not actually a parent selector. It's called a relative selector because it chooses things other than parents. So you could, with CSS, say if this H2 has 3 sibling H2s, right, after it, then style it this way. So you could, before, by doing H2 nth last of type 3n plus 1, that would basically say nth last of type n plus 3. So it would do like the third from the last one, the fourth from the last one, and the fifth from the last one would be styled a certain way. But it could only be if it was all the same type, so all H2s. The relative selectors, which is the has, which is known as the parent selector, and that's what people are thinking it is, can do that too. So it's not just does it have this as a child or a grandchild or or as a descendant, but it's also does it have this following it that is of a different type. So the has is : has, open parentheses, close parentheses, inside those parentheses. So basically it's a functional selector. It takes a forgiving list of relative selectors. So let me first go over what a forgiving list is. When you include a list of selectors, so like let's say it's just regular selectors and you have a P, comma, H2, comma, foobar, no comma. Is foobar valid? Well, if it has nothing in...
And foobar is like a class here? Or what is foobar?
It's just the word foobar.
Oh, just the word foobar. Okay.
It could be a foobar element. That's valid because you can create a foobar element. If it has a period foobar or a pound sign foobar, totally valid because it could be a class or it could be an ID. But if you put colon in front of foobar or double colon in front of foobar, it's not just that that's not valid because foobar is not a class or pseudo class. It invalidates the entire selector list. So when you put a selector list like that inside a parent, normally that's called a normal selector list. Those are not forgiving. If you put a selector list like that has something that's invalid inside a not, or inside an is, or inside a where, or inside a has.
Is it like an or statement?
It's a forgiving list. And it says, if we don't understand something, we're just going to skip it.
Okay.
We're not going to fail everything. So the is and the where was super useful once they were supported to test new features, because if you have a new pseudo element or pseudo class or a browser specific pseudo element, like let's say : dash moz dash scroll dash thumb. I don't know if that's an actual element. I just made that up. But the thumb of a scroll bar or the thumb of a range, WebKit will have a WebKit in front of it. Moz will have, because they all have different, basically shadow DOM to create these widgets. You can style those, but if you put that in a selector list and the browser doesn't recognize it and it's invalid, it ignores the entire selector block. So that's why in the past, we used to, you'll find in old code bases, they'll have the exact same style repeated over and over and over again because each one has a different selector targeting a different browser in front of it. Now you can do is : and put the moz and the WebKit prefix together so you can style the thumbs the same way in one block because of this forgiving selector list. So that's what a forgiving selector list is. So has takes a forgiving selector list. You can make, you can include stuff that doesn't exist in a specific browser in that list. It'll be fine. But what a relative selector list is one that starts with a combinator. So in CSS, your combinators are like a space, a greater than sign, a tilde, and a plus right now. Those are called combinators. And basically the has assumes that if you don't have a combinator, it assumes that there's a space in front of the selector in the has. So it assumes you mean child by default. Unless you put a plus, which means adjacent sibling, or a tilde, which means any sibling coming after it, not just the next one. So that's how has works. So has does more than just parents, but just realize that you don't need to put a combinator in, but it will put the space combinator in for you. So if it's not doing what you think it's doing, that might be why.
So Estelle, that's a really interesting explanation of kind of the technical constraints of how to use it and whatnot. So can you give us an example of why someone would want to use the has selector? Like what's an actual practical use case for it?
So an actual practical use case for it is, there is one other thing that acts like the has, which is focus within. Is something inside focused, but you don't want it to necessarily have focus. So focus within was super powerful. You can open up, I created the navigation for Williams-Sonoma for all 6 brands, and their nav bar originally, I don't know if they've changed it back because I don't know if they understood what I did. When you tab into a navigation bar, right? So like if you go to the web.dev learn section right now and you tab into the navigation bar on a narrow screen, you don't see where the mouse is because it's going through all the links, but it's not showing up because you never opened up the widget. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, you can open it up with JavaScript, but you need to know that the person tabbed in there. But you can just do that with CSS. You can do li:, the name of, my sidebar, focus within, make it visible. Mm-hmm. So on Williams-Sonoma, when you are in one of the navigation bars and your focus you've tabbed into there, the drop-down menu will be open. So focus within is kind of like a parent selector. It's saying, if the parent of the ancestor, I'm an ancestor of something that has focus, make me visible or do whatever you want to me. Mm-hmm. Similarly, has says, if I am the parent or the ancestor of this thing that's happening, it's not just limited to focus. If there's a child that's invalid, like let's say there's a form control and you want to show that form control because there's something invalid, you can do it that way. Or we have the target pseudo class, which is super cool. Mm-hmm. But that's limited to just target. You can use it for similar things to target is saying when you're focused on this, when the page has gone down to this section, scroll down to this section on purpose, do this thing with it. But if you continue focusing, scrolling down, so you can do a combination of many, many things. But like the example on MDN is H1, H2, or H3. So if an element is an H1, H2, or H3, and it has as a next sibling an H2, H3, or H4, then give it some extra margin. So basically it's combining what you would do SAS with. You'd say H1, H2, H3, and then nest inside the A plus H2 plus H3 plus H4. How'd you get to that parent, though? Like, you want to give the margin to, the previous sibling. You want to give the margin to the previous sibling. So you could, H2, like I said before, if you use nth last of type, you can go back up the tree. But if it's a different type, you can't. So here it's saying like a byline. You'll have a byline that has an H1 followed immediately by a paragraph. Well, you want to style that H1 based on the fact that it has a paragraph after it. How do you do that?
That's like a conditional.
This is what has does for you. Yeah.
I see. Oh, fascinating. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we have so cascade layers. There's some new stuff with HTML. We're going to take a quick break and then kind of dig into those topics. So we'll be right back, everyone.
This episode is brought to you by Retool, and they have a private beta ready for you to check out. This is the fastest way to now build native mobile apps for your mobile workforce. There is no complex frameworks anymore or tedious deployments. You can build mobile apps with what you already know, like JS and SQL. This is all in the browser, no code, or what they call low code. Join the wait list. Head to retool.com/products/mobile. The link will be in the show notes. Again, retool.com/products/mobile.
All right, Estelle, wow. So that was super deep. And oh my gosh, like there's just so much complexity that I'm just kind of still mind blown at like how deep the rabbit hole goes. It really goes deep. Like we've been talking about this for a while, but it's pretty deep. And so another kind of maybe really cool feature that I've been hearing about, but I don't really know much about yet, is cascade layers. And you mentioned in the break that like, once you learn about cascade layers, you're never going to use bang important again. And I'm telling you, bang important is like my saving grace when I'm really frustrated and I'm working in a big application and I'm like, I just want this to work. And I'm too lazy to like go figure out why this isn't working. You know, bang important saves the day for me. So can you tell us what are cascade layers and why do they make bang important irrelevant?
They don't necessarily make it irrelevant, but they make it so that you don't need to fall back on it. So what cascade layers does, well, let me explain a little bit the cascade.
Okay.
So I think people understand selectors and that the more specific a selector is, whichever selector is most specific, every property can only have one value. Mm-hmm. So if you say the color of the text is blue and the text of the color is red, which one does it pick? It picks the one with the most specificity. However, if you don't style anything at all, the color is going to be black. And where does that come from? That comes from the user agent style sheet. So there's 3 sources of style sheets. There's the user agent, the user, and the author, which is you, the developer. Mm. So you're really only concerned with the developer because for some reason, everything always overwrites what the browser is saying it wants. So you can have your own style sheet. Very few people do. I don't really worry about it much because of the cascade.
Okay.
Now the cascade says whatever the browser says is least important, then the user, then the developer styles. Mm-hmm. Then developer important, then user important, then browser important.
Okay.
So why browser important? Browsers don't really put many important things in. One thing that it does put important on is a password has to have hidden text.
Yes.
You know, you can't, as a developer, say bang important, make this text visible.
Password visible.
Yep.
Yeah.
It will not do that for you. So there, like you just understood with that one example how the cascade works. It's user agent, user,
browser.
And I think that's the order, but I never do user, so I could possibly be wrong, but I don't think so. Then developer, then developer important, then user important, then browser important.
Browser important, right, okay.
The only thing you can really control is the author styles.
Right.
But the thing is, what happens is everything cascades together. So if you have a third-party script that, you know, if you have a third-party widget that comes with CSS, that CSS is conflicting with your CSS. So what Cascade Layer does is it creates an order similar to the way we have user agent, user, and developer, but it's something that you can control. So you can basically say that I want the styles from this block to be in my first Cascade layer. I want the CSS from Bootstrap to be in my second layer. Mm-hmm. I want this to be in my third layer, and I want these things are unlayered. Mm-hmm. So you can basically say this widget coming in from a third party goes into my first declared layer. Mm-hmm. So you can have exactly how you have the Cascade layers between user agent, user, and developer. You can have the same type of cascade order within the developer layer or author layer of Bootstrap, Component X, and your own styles. So what happens with the cascade is if the user had put $main, $container, $foobar, input, background color red, if you had put input background color blue, yours won out. Even though the specificity of theirs is higher than yours, it doesn't matter because they're in a different cascade layer. They're in the user layer. Let's say you have a Bootstrap and you have things that are reliant on Bootstrap, but you want to override it. You can actually put it in the first layer and then your new styles will override it and you don't have to worry about what the classes are. Mm-hmm. Because like everything you just did just overrode everything theirs. Right. Because if they put #, which is the specificity of 300, your 001 will override theirs because your cascade layer came later. That's why you don't need to use important, because if you just stick the cruft or this third-party widget, which is giving you cruft, into a cascade layer, whatever CSS you write, if you're targeting that element, will be more, there's still inheritance. If it's inheriting, you have to actually target the element. if they're targeting the element and you were just hoping it would inherit.
Yeah.
But you don't have to use important. You just put in a cascade and you don't have to fight that specificity war. Like specificity wars with cascade layers are a thing of the past. The thing is, if they put an important in their cascade layer, then just like user important is more important than author important, and the developer, rather the user agent is more important than the user and the author important, the earlier cascade layer is more important than the other important.
Yeah.
So a useless piece of trivia is that important is actually a flag. Most people think it's a keyword, but it's a flag. So if you put bang space important, it actually still works. So I documented it as part of my job for Open Web Docs. I documented important on MDN, and I think it's the only time important has actually been fully documented. It's a rabbit hole.
Yeah, literally read the docs. Wait, but hold on. Are you saying that like important literally was never documented until you just documented it? Like this is like the segment of like repeated words because we've said important like 3 times in a row. Important of important. So documentation of the documentation. Like, yeah, anyways.
So in the specification, there's no section that discusses important fully. It does say there's one sentence that says, the important flag. That's how I found out it was a flag. So I went and I looked and tried to find. It could. I just didn't find it.
Okay.
So I did document important as best as I could, including playing around with the fact that you can put spaces in between the bang and the word important.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a flag. The bang is a flag with the keyword important.
Okay.
So that's useless trivia. So back to cascade layers.
No, honestly though, points for saying the word important 30 times, like in a way that was actually meaningful, not just nonsense, but yeah. But anyway, so yeah.
I have very important skill sets.
Okay.
So back to cascade layers. So how do you declare a cascade layer?
Yeah.
So the best way to declare a cascade layer. So we've been told to never use @import inside a style. Because I can't remember why we were told, but it's been supported since forever, and we were always told use link instead. Mm-hmm. You can't link into a cascade layer, but you can import into a cascade layer.
Okay.
So if you don't have control over a style sheet, you can't, if you can't write to it, you can't put the whole thing into a cascade layer. So you have to import it into a cascade layer. So what you do is you do @import, the name of the file, and then layer. And you can either give it a name or not give it a name. Layer is a functional notation. And you can either put the name of the layer or not put the name of the layer. The order of the cascade layers is the order in which they're declared. So we've always been told that @import has to be the first thing in your style block. That is not the case. There's 2 things that can precede it, which is the content type and the cascade layer. So you can put those in front of it, and you do want to put it in front of it generally. You can do an import directly into a cascade layer, but the best way to control your cascade layer order is to do a cascade layer declaration before everything and just say, this is the order of the cascades that I want.
Okay.
The neat thing is, let's say you're doing something on mobile, you can actually put the cascade declarations within a media query and say, I want this, on mobile, on a narrow screen, I want this one to be more important than on a wide screen. The thing with cascade layers, though, is once you set the cascade order, it's immutable. You can't change. There's no trick to changing the order of the cascade layers.
Oh, JavaScript developers can't be smart and then in runtime change,
Right.
Like the order of something, right? Like, how what is it, document write or script write? I'm talking about where that document write, script write, where you can edit things real time for rendering engines. You can't do that here. It's just...
Right.
Okay.
So the way I actually tested it when I was originally testing it is I like to do this thing where I style my style. So I make my style visible.
Okay, so I didn't even know you could style your style. So I think Wes Boss had this recent viral tweet about this. And you're like, I've been styling my style since 1999, kids. What are you all excited about? So can you tell us about, I didn't even know, what is the styling of the style? So explain, please.
I did a CSS workshop for Front-End Masters. It's since been archived, but it's still available if you search for my name. But I did another version of it, and it was 1,400 slides that were about 700 were interactive. And because it was a 34-hour workshop, they never actually edited it, so it never went live. But the slides are available if you go to estelle.github.io/CSS. Just remember my name, Estelle.
Yeah, we'll put a link in the notes. Yeah.
github.io/CSS. It's from 2018 or 2019, I think. So it's a little bit dated, but it's still most of it's still super useful. But all of those slides, the way I made them interactive is I just put a style in the document. I said, display the header block, the head of my HTML display it block. Then display none on everything other than the style that has content editable attribute on it.
Oh, okay.
So by putting the content editable attribute on it, I made the style block editable. And when you style it, when you edit the CSS itself, it's like a live CSS editor. So, I mean, you can do this on CodePen as well, but that is how I show examples.
Yeah, I think that's so cool because I think most developers, I mean, at least I do anyway, just go ahead, open your DevTools and just play around. But that's so much more work sometimes because you've got to find the element, then play around with that, futzy. So, I mean, being able to actually work in that real time, that is super cool. Is there like an example that you can give us a link to so our listeners can check that out?
Yeah, give me 1 second and I will pull one up.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, we'll do that async, but there'll be a link in the show notes.
So when I'm doing that workshop and people are learning, like I'm explaining it, they can actually play with, it doesn't work as well for selectors. Even though I do it with selectors, you can change the selectors and you can say, hey, if I'm selecting every fifth element, the list items will change below it. Mm-hmm. If you're changing the background color, the deck for custom variables, if you change the values on slide like 5, I'm just making a number up, I don't know which one it is, the entire deck will change colors.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Wow. That's pretty powerful.
So that's styling the style. And the reason that I can do that, not just that you can actually style your style, mm-hmm. is the content editable attribute.
Okay.
So the content editable attribute is actually, it's been around, I know that I used it when I was doing IE5 on the Mac. So that would be 2003. 2002, maybe 2001. I don't know. It was a long time ago. Mm-hmm. So the content editable lets you edit text. So you can add that to a div and make it content editable. The thing with when you add content editable, normally you need to add a tab index to something to make it focusable. If something has content editable, it enters into the focusable order. So you don't need to add a tab index to content editable. And then when I was diving into this, the thing that I've discovered is that content editable is an enumerated attribute. So there's a difference. Most people think that content editable is Boolean. And with Boolean attributes, if the attribute is present, it doesn't matter what the value is. Mm-hmm. What is a Boolean? Hidden, I thought was a Boolean, but it's not.
Is it a string? It's a string because it's an HTML attribute? I don't know.
No. So the difference between Boolean and enumerated is Boolean is either true or false. Mm-hmm. So its presence means that it will be true. Mm-hmm. Its absence means that it's false.
Right.
You can, like with XHTML, when we were way back, it feels like 3 hours ago, but it was probably 15 minutes ago in our conversation, we were talking about XHTML and how it was strict. So when we were doing XHTML style, you had to put a value in for a Boolean attribute. You don't have to put an attribute in for Boolean attribute. Just its presence makes it... Oh, a good one is required. Something is either required or it's not required. There's no other options. Mm-hmm. So required on an input is a Boolean value. If you put required equals required, yep, it's true. But if you put required equals false, it's also true. If you put required equals 27, it's also true. It's still required.
Okay.
So people think that they can put required equals false and it'll be false, but no, you actually have to remove a Boolean attribute for it to be false. Enumerated is different. Enumerated, by definition, means that there's, like, you can see the word number in enumerated. Mm-hmm. So it means that there's a number of valid values. Mm-hmm. So content editable, I thought, was either true or false, but it isn't. It's enumerated. And a lot of times, an invalid value on an enumerated value will be the same as the truthy value, even though the truthy value isn't necessarily true. So content editable is a weird one because if you put content editable equals content editable, which is not a value for content editable, I get prizes for saying content editable 15 times in one sentence as well. If you put content editable as a value, it basically changes to inherit. So inherit is not a valid value of content editable, but that is the default value when it is invalid, I believe.
Yeah, let me just frame stuff for our listeners so that, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Just in case, because I think we made a jump over to HTML without really transitioning this conversation.
Okay.
I wanted to make sure everyone knew that like, no, it's okay. Content editable is an HTML attribute. And we're not talking about HTML. The hidden property and all of that, those are all things that go on elements as well. So that's another attribute, just in case it wasn't super obvious, because, it
can happen.
The relationship blurred, but it can happen. It can happen to anyone.
Okay.
Yes, back to you, Estelle.
We went from styling the style, which is CSS, but it's actually style is an HTML element.
It's style an HTML element. Yeah, that was our bridge. That was our land bridge.
Yeah.
That's where the worlds meet. There's an HTML block that gets CSS inside, and that's how the two hold hands. Anyways, yeah, okay. So this is like a nursery rhyme for developers that I just made up on the fly. So excuse my singing and bad lyrics.
Nothing personal, but keep your day job.
Keep my day job. Damn it! There goes my retirement plan, Estelle. You're just busting dreams over here. What's going on? Yeah, all right. Songwriter Amal is never going to be a thing.
I think just with a little bit more work on it.
With a little more practice, it could work.
We're geeks, and we would probably totally go for it and would become viral.
Oh, yeah.
I totally think you should do it. I totally think that's...
Yeah, nursery rhymes for developers.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do it. It's going to happen. Okay, so back to you, Estelle. For real this time.
So back to content editable. Yeah.
Yes.
So content editable has two values of true and false. So you'd think it was Boolean, but it isn't Boolean. It's enumerated. There is possibly a third value coming.
Okay.
But that's on hold.
So it's an enum list, right? So not an actual enum, but you know what I mean? It's an enumerated list that's here's value 0 is true, value 1, or these are the list of valid values, and those values are part of an enumerated list, and we're extending it to include other things than true and false.
So the default value of it not being there.
Yeah.
Well, it depends.
Is the default value editable?
The default value, if the attribute is present, the default value is true. If the attribute is present with an empty string, it's true. If it's present with an invalid value, such as content editable, it is. So if you say content editable, or content editable equals foobar, it is inherit. But inherit is not an enumerated value. And the reason it's enumerated, even though it has only true and false, is one, because an erroneous value is not the same as the default value of it being present and empty. Mm-hmm. And Buku, your former company, is working on standardizing a new value called plain text only. Mm-hmm. So plain text only, I believe, let me see. Plain text only indicates that the element's raw text is editable, but rich text formatting is disabled. Mm. But that is not supported in any browser yet, but Buku is actually working on getting that implemented, and it's not yet in the spec, so I think it's going to be behind a flag when it comes, but we might have a new value, and that's why the fact that it's enumerated is important, because there's going to be another value. But the important thing to learn also is that the invalid value is different than the empty value. So that brings us to the hidden attribute. So the hidden attribute actually has a new value. And the new value is until found.
Okay, until found. Interesting. I mean, so If inherited in this case would really mean it's coming from the user style as agent is my guess, or whatever defaults are in the browser.
Nope, this is not CSS. This is an HTML.
Oh, wait, sorry. Oh my God, here I am. Oh my God, I knew this was HTML, but like I'm like using a CSS methodology to think about what inherited means. Like, you know, this is where like the blurred lines kind of, right? Because CSS, again, it might probably obvious for many people, but just in case, actually stands for cascading style sheets. So, yeah.
So hidden until found element will actually be visible, take up the space on the page, but the content will not be visible. And with JavaScript, so basically there's when focus lands on the hidden until found, there's a before match that happens, which is an event.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's an event. And that changes the state until, like, it's basically hidden until found. It's been found, so it's not hidden anymore.
Interesting.
So that's coming to a browser near you. I can tell you the browser support. It's not in Firefox yet, but it is in Edge and Chrome. And I believe it is in the interop, so it should be in Firefox and Safari probably before. You know, it's coming.
Oh, wow. Very cool. Very cool.
That's a very cool feature. And that means that hidden is not a Boolean attribute, it's an enumerated one. And that's why, as pedantic as my discussion was about Boolean versus enumerated, it's actually super important because you don't necessarily know, like, basically my suggestion to people is when you have a hidden enumerated or Boolean attribute, do not put a value unless you check that value and you know that it is correct, because both, like, Boolean is definitely true when it's present, definitely false when it's not present. That you don't need to remember at all. But if it's enumerated, you actually have to remember exactly what the valid values are. And so if you just don't put a valid value, you just leave it empty, it'll default usually to the value that you thought it was supposed to have.
Like the truthy value. But I mean, but isn't that on like the spec authors? Like, should we, like, you know, I don't know. This is where I feel like we're getting into parts of the spec where it's like, the intuitive factor is pretty low, right? Like in terms of like it should work this way, but it actually is this other way, and right, and that just like goes back to HTML and all the, you know, there's like I've heard some crazy stats about browser engines and how like so much time is spent between converting strings to numbers and back to, you know, strings and numbers like get translated like a million times, and like a part of our processing time for parsing HTML and JavaScript actually is just going to that, right? So like there isn't like type standardization essentially. Like is that something that like, or maybe I'm trying to simplify something that's not simple. I don't know.
You're actually comparing JavaScript to HTML and to CSS.
Yeah, which is its own beast.
Well, JavaScript is not forgiving at all. If you make a mistake
Right.
in JavaScript, your JavaScript doesn't work. If you make a mistake in CSS, it just skips on to the next thing. It's just like, I'm not going to deal with that. I'm just going on.
Right.
If you make a mistake in HTML, there's some mistakes which you can't recover from, such as I mentioned earlier, not closing the style tag, not closing a script, or not closing a text area. I don't know if that's it, but that's pretty close to it being it. Maybe the picture element, I don't know. I guess it would be an invalid picture and it would show the content inside a picture or a video. I'm not sure. I haven't tried those. Now I know what I'm going to be doing this evening because that's my life. The important thing is, like, the reason that they have the difference between enumerated and Boolean, they actually made it really easy. It's just like you put the attribute there without a value and you're good to go 98% of the time. But that 1% when it's failing, you just have to remember that, oh, maybe it was an enumerated value. But if you don't have a value on that enumerated attribute, it is going to do likely what you thought it was going to do. Like hidden until found. Yeah, hidden equals until found. Usually when you put hidden, hidden is true. It is hidden, right?
Yeah.
If you don't put hidden, it's not hidden. And so you're only going to put a value on it when you know that you want until found. So they did really make it easy for us. But I think the lesson that we learn here is there's so much in HTML that it's so incredibly powerful.
We got to learn it. We got to spend the time.
We have to take the time to learn it. I dive into a lot of these things in the web.dev/learn/HTML. I talk about content editable not that much. I do provide an example of styling your style. I don't talk about cascade layers at all. Oh, I do a teeny bit. Even though it's in HTML,
Yeah.
I talk a lot about accessibility. And the thing is, we haven't really talked about accessibility for many of these things. But the thing to note is that HTML, for the most part, is by default accessible. There are some not accessible features in HTML, but if you actually use the right elements for the right behaviors, you're going to, by default, have an accessible site. If you remember to put your alt attributes with descriptive text, and there's some things that fail, like SVG doesn't have an alt attribute. So you have to think for, I believe it's Safari, you need to write role image, role equals image. So Safari knows that it's, the Safari screen reader voiceover knows, maybe it's fixed, I don't know. But you put role equals image and then you put an ARIA label if your SVG doesn't have a title. But if you put the title, then it would be fine. So a good example is the radio button. The radio button, a lot of times I'll start a talk based on the fact that I talked to someone and that I thought knew everything and they don't know this one thing. So I asked a bunch of developers what the name attribute does on the radio button.
Oh, the name attribute.
Yeah.
Huh.
These developers worked at a company that created the original radio button component for Ember.
Okay.
Now, Ember is doing really well on accessibility, but this was several years ago. And they had a component that did radio buttons, but the radio buttons didn't even use the radio element. I mean, input type radio. It used divs. Why reinvent the wheel? All of these input types are generally by default accessible. Like I don't know if the color one is very accessible, but input text is accessible. Radio button is accessible if you have a label, if you code it correctly. So you need to know that every radio button needs to have a label. The thing is, the label usually on a radio button comes after the radio button. And let's say you have two radio buttons. One says true, one says false. Those are the labels for those radio buttons. Well, what's the question? Like the screen reader will see the true and the false, but they don't know what the question is, and you don't have a second label. So you can either use a lot of ARIA and give two labels to each, say labeled by, and then to the IDs of the label and the paragraph in front of it, or you could use a field set around the two radio buttons. And the screen reader will say, here's a field set. The legend says, this is a podcast, true or false. You have true, you have false. The labels say true, the label says false. The legend has what the question is. So the screen reader user knows, like it associates the whole thing. But you have to learn HTML to get that right. So the one thing that the people didn't know is what the name attribute does. So remember how I said true or false?
Yeah.
And you can only pick one?
Yeah.
Well, how can you only pick one? You know how radio buttons will turn one off when you turn the other one on? That's done because the radio buttons have the same name. So when you have like the name attribute, it used to be that instead of using ID, you'd use name for in-page links, which were called something identifiers, fragment identifiers. So you used to use name. You don't use name anymore. You use ID. But the name attribute on the input, because people use JavaScript, and I'm going to say use AJAX, but basically use HTTP requests to send back and forth data. They're not actually submitting forms that much anymore. A lot of people don't know that inputs should usually have name value pairs. So an input of type text doesn't need a value because you're entering the value. But every single radio button should have a name and every single radio button should have a value. Because if you're submitting the radio button that says true in the label...
It's an input type, more or less, yeah.
Yeah. You need to send something to the server. So the name attribute on a radio button says every single same named radio button, it's basically a radio group, and only one can be active at a time. Now, what you get with that is when the user hits the right arrow, it'll go to the next radio button without selecting it. The keyboard user can actually navigate through all of them without selecting any of them, which you get for free. So why reinvent that with a component? Because you're not going to get all of the features that come natively with a radio button. You're not going to get all those accessibility bonuses. You're not going to get, when you have a label associated with that radio button, if you're using a mouse, you have the entire label. If you click on the mouse, it turns on that radio button. So you have all these extra features. So when you learn HTML, I mean, you don't need to learn HTML as deeply as I do. I am creating a series on web.dev that covers a lot of the stuff that we've just covered now, but I'm not the one who wrote the form control ones. So I definitely suggest going to MDN. I suggest going to my workshop.
Yeah. Is Google, because web.dev is a Google project and site, super awesome, great resource. I'm sure all of you have run into it unknowingly or knowingly already, but we'll link it in the notes as well. And so are you contracting with Google, or is this through your open web docs work?
No, my open web docs work is 99% of that is actually working on MDN. I do a few other, a few other projects, but this is a separate contract.
Oh, very nice.
So my full-time job is open web docs.
You're contracting with the Chrome team, I guess, or someone on the Chrome team. Yeah.
And I'm contracting with Google Chrome, exactly. Mm-hmm. If any of your readers work for a company that uses MDN a lot, the main contributors to MDN right now are open web docs, and it is funded by
all the browsers,
by corporations and individuals. Not all the browsers. We have
individuals too. I didn't know that. Okay.
We have Edge and Google funding us.
I figured it was all the browsers because people I guess there was that's sad because I thought that there was this movement a few years ago around acknowledging MDN as actual documentation for web standards. And so it was I thought when that happened and they created the Open Web Docs Foundation or nonprofit, whatever it is, I figured that was okay, all the vendors are coming together and supporting this project in a neutral space. That's not Mozilla.
Some vendors, definitely.
Some vendors, not all. Got it. Okay. Got it.
Mozilla doesn't donate to MDN, to Open Web Docs, but they have their own staff, and we work really closely with their team.
I see.
So they're actually hopefully growing their team, but it's basically our two groups work together to get it done. We have a steering committee. The steering committee is more an open group. The GC, which stands for, can't remember what GC stands for. It's basically the overarching, they're the ones who do the funding. That you have to be a paying member to be a part of. So on the Open Web Docs website, which I could open right now and find all the answers to all of the questions that I'm blanking on right now.
Yeah, that's fine. We'll put links in the show notes for everything so people can look that up. So before we kind of wrap up this really long discussion, I'm just letting it flow at this point.
Okay.
This is an academic discussion and, I'm here for it. So, but before we kind of wrap this up, what are folks getting wrong often and what are folks confused about all the time? Because I remember one of my first kind of exposures to some of your work actually was this awesome talk that you did about carousels and how most carousels on the web are completely inaccessible. And when you write an accessible carousel, which is something that you can do, and you really will link to your talk where you kind of break it down and explain how to write an accessible carousel. Folks who were using screen readers, you said that they didn't recognize it. They're there's no way that this is a carousel because it just works with my screen reader in the way that I would expect it to. But that most of their experiences on the web were not they were with inaccessible carousels. So they have learned to navigate around it. And so can you I'm just curious, what are folks still kind of confused about and what are they getting wrong? Because we know that we need to learn deeply about HTML and CSS and it's a one-time investment that pays off, right? But
if you really learn HTML, I give a 45-minute talk on the radio button. I mean, it sounds like it would be incredibly boring, but the radio button has so much depth.
It was a great talk.
Thanks.
Yeah.
It has default features that when you create a custom component or custom element, and you're not using semantic. So when you use a semantic element, like an element that has semantic meaning, or an interactive element that is by default interactive, the browser provides you with all of this stuff. And if you use a div or a span, or you use the wrong type of element for something, you have to reinvent all those features. So the way the radio button one worked is, I call it a merry-go-round. So if you look up HTML merry-go-round, you'll probably end up on my GitHub repo, or you could just go to github.com/Estelle and it's there, or you could link to it from estelle.github.io because it lists all of my projects. But what I did is I did basically 3 labels, which were addresses, and then I did 3 radio buttons. And when you went from one radio button to the next radio button, I just did a hide show of which one had focus. And so the screen reader user didn't realize, like there was no way of them knowing that the label was not directly attached and right next to the radio button, because they know it's a radio button and they got the address and they could click it. And that's what we wanted them to do, was to click it. The only problem with that, and that's why you need to learn HTML, is you're not supposed to put interactive elements inside a label. Because if you put an interactive element inside a label, if you remember when I said earlier, the label provides a hit area. Well, if you have a link in that hit area and you click on that link, is it the link or is it the hit area?
That hit area is a tricky thing, though, right? Like in general, I've been on UI teams where like it's like, what's the selectable content? Is it the whole row or is it the actual text content, or like is it the link? Like, you know what I mean? That hit area is it's not something I feel like we've standardized, and I feel like the right thing should be the row or the whole area, like the area that's wider than just the link. But I don't know. You tell me what's more accessible, Estelle.
Well, the thing with the link is when a link is active, like if you have a bunch of letters together, the link is not just the letter S. You don't have to, like if you're using the default blue, you don't have to click on that blue. It's the whole text area. So basically within that line height, to the, I think it's the inner padding, but maybe it's into the border area. I don't know. I have another thing to figure out again tonight. And the thing is, I probably used to know that, and I just don't remember it right now. Yeah. But it's one of those things, if I was writing a bunch of links, that I would probably pay attention to. If you put a link inside a label, the browser is not going to throw up and say, no, you can't do this. But your users are going to throw up and say they can't do this because they can't click on the link. Because every time they click on the link, the radio button right next to it gets clicked on and off.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like when it says, do you agree with these terms and conditions? And then it has the terms and conditions, and then it says, you click on this to get to the links and conditions.
Yeah, I've experienced websites that have this exact same problem. It's like the clickable area and the link, and like, you're trying to click something that's a link and you're trying to open. I feel like I've seen this on government websites where it's like you're trying to like click on something that should open a modal or a new tab, and it's selecting an input checkbox, or like airline checkout screens, like, but anyways, I mean, so that's something people commonly get wrong. Anything else on the CSS side? Like, what's confusing people?
I think on CSS, people do not understand specificity and they don't know the selectors. So when I develop content, I very rarely use class names, because I've discovered that class names is added cruft, and it means like, if I'm going to style everything that's in Spanish and make it italic, I should base it on the language when I say everything else is English, but this section is Spanish. So instead of doing span class translate this language sp dot or whatever the language, totally blanking on languages right now, I can use the language selector, which is lang, colon lang parentheses, or I can use the attribute selector, and then I don't need to add a class. And then if something else gets translated, no one else has to remember that they need to add a class.
That's true.
Yeah. With my radio buttons, I do input type radio plus label, and then I know that it's a label that comes right after a radio button. That's where it's always going to be.
Yeah, it's like you're doing extensible, like you're designing it to be extensible and scalable. That makes sense.
What I think people get wrong is not necessarily get wrong, but if you really learn all these selectors, and I do have, it's on YouTube, there's a selector workshop. I gave a 3-hour selector workshop at SF HTML5, which is San Francisco HTML5.org. So their YouTube channel has like, I guess it's 2.5 hours because they cut some parts out, like the breaks. It's long, but it's actually worth it. And that's the most recent one I gave, because I gave that one right before the pandemic. It does not have has in it, but it has almost everything else.
Oh, nice. Yeah. We'll link to that in our show notes, as well as a bunch of other great resources Estelle generally has. But yeah.
Learn your selectors, learn specificity. And I have a cheat sheet called specificity.com. So just spell it's specificity with fish and plankton and sharks and the atomic bomb, because why not?
Oh, gosh.
So that's a little bit outdated, but it doesn't have has, is, or where, but it has everything else in there.
Yeah, it's got the majority of the stuff. Yeah, no, I mean, that's super cool. And container queries, this is another feature that we're not going to have time to get into today. I think that's really, it's going to be its own discussion in the future that's landed. And I want to just give a shout out to one of our listeners, Jarvis Yang, who put a link in our Slack channel recently about a new project that just like, it's a simple web app that showcases Pokemon cards and all these cool CSS features. It's mind-boggling to think that somebody developed these Pokemon cards with just CSS and HTML because it looks like some 3D gaming rendering engine. It's wild. So
I took a look at that. I highly recommend looking at it.
yeah, it's another good learning tool, I think.
When I saw that, I'm like, God, I don't know CSS. And the thing is, I do know CSS, but I know much more pedantic CSS. You can go from anything from like what we talked about a long time ago, which is what language your list bullets should be in, to creating 3D effects that look like there's a reflection or hologram. I mean, like you can do so much stuff with CSS. CSS is really easy and really difficult. It takes almost no time to learn the basics.
Like the mastery is different. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of like piano versus guitar.
You don't need to master it. What you need to know is what it's capable of.
Yeah.
What you do need to master is the basics. Like there was someone who did this really cool example the other day of a new feature, and I couldn't link to it because it was not accessible because they used divs for everything and they didn't have alt attributes on their images. So anyone like, I couldn't say, look at this, it's a great example of doing this feature, because you wouldn't know how to code correctly and you couldn't extend it. So like the last thing I did on Open Web Docs is on MDN, I changed every single HTML intro element to include the language attribute, to include the viewport, and to include a title, because I want to make sure that people are coding accurately. We're currently doing a thing where we're making sure that every single image has an alt attribute.
Yeah, you want people to, if they inspect it or they're trying to copy literally the source, which they're learning how to do it the right way, that the actual source is also doing it the right way.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's so cool, Estelle. Thank you for that.
Take the time to learn to do the basics, because your JavaScript will be much easier. It's much easier to use a dialogue element that takes care of 98% of what you want to do and add a few features to it than it is to rewrite the dialogue.
To use like a portal and to use JavaScript to do a bunch of fancy stuff. Yeah, agreed. We talk a lot about this on the show. It's like, even though this is JS Party, like, please, like, use HTML and CSS to do the things where it's best to use HTML and CSS. Like, using JavaScript to do everything is pretty expensive decision in the long run. And it's also often not the best, right? So with that said, Estelle, so where can folks follow you? And then do you do any workshops if folks are interested in hiring you for their companies or whatever to teach? How can people also just generally support your work? And by the way, your earlier comment on like, I don't know if I know CSS because of this Pokemon thing, you literally co-authored the giant CSS definitive guide, which is like this encyclopedia for CSS, the O'Reilly book, with Eric Myers, who's another awesome person.
He actually is an awesome person.
He really is. Yeah, we've had him on the show before, but I'm just saying that like, and I interviewed him for my other podcast, the Web Platform podcast, many years ago. So yeah, like I just want to say you are definitely one of our experts. So like, you're the one person who's not allowed to say, I don't know CSS. Like, I'm sorry. I do not accept that statement.
Thank you.
But going back to
where you can find me.
Yeah. Where you can find you.
You can find me on Mastodon Social. I am Estelle on Mastodon Social. I am Estelle on cohost.org. I am Estelle VW on Twitter, but I might not be on Twitter for long. I am Estelle on GitHub. So basically, if Estelle isn't me, look for Estelle VW, which is my middle initial and my last initial. If you want to hire me to teach at your company, I would love it. I teach on CSS, HTML, and accessibility. I don't do accessibility purely workshops but I can refer you to people who do. I teach people how to use CSS and HTML in an accessible way so that their sites are by default accessible. I don't teach how to make your components, like how to reconfigure your components to be accessible. For that, you would want Marcy Sutton because she's amazing. I don't know if you've had her on your show.
I have not, but we may have. Another host may have had her on the show, but she is amazing and phenomenal. And she's another person who I'm like really a huge fan of. So even if we have had her on the show, I want to have her back in the future. So if you're listening to this, Marcy, I will be contacting you.
And Melanie Sumner is another one who does accessible JavaScript. She's the one who does the accessibility features for Ember.js.
Nice.
So if you want to reach out to me to do a workshop, you can find me on any of those social media. My email is my first name at my last name.org. I will not say how that's written, but if you know my first name and you know my last name at the .org, and you'll find me. I just don't want the bots on the captions to add me to mailing lists.
Nice. Smart. Look at you. Smart.
Just one thing. If you want to see the work, MDN, love people to contribute. Open Web Docs, love people to contribute. web.dev/html/learn. And then books. If you have Safari online, which is how O'Reilly distributes. And if you are a member of Front End Masters, you can find my work by searching my name because my talks have been archived. The CSS selectors workshop is still super valid, even though it's from 2018 on that one.
Cool. Awesome. Well, again, it's been an absolute pleasure. I feel like I should be saying Dr. Estelle Weyl, but you're like a doctor, like honorary doctor of the web, I feel like. But thank you. Thank you for everything that you do. Thank you.
This is a podcast, so people can't see I'm turning red. But thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and you are a joy to talk to.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Estelle. Thank you so much. So that's all for this week, everyone. We'll talk to you next week. We've got some really awesome shows lined up till the end of the year. We're literally booking out our guests 3 months at this point. So lots of really great stuff coming ahead. And thank you again to Estelle, and we will chat soon, everyone. Bye-bye.
All right, you made it all the way to the end. Good on ya. Long episode, so here's a short goodbye. Thanks once again to Fastly, Fly.io, Breakmaster Cylinder, and to you for listening. That's all for now. We'll talk to you again next week.
King